Dear viewers, what would you do if you discovered the person you just humiliated was the reason your family exists? Today's story is about a powerful Korean mafia boss whose entire world shattered when his mother recognized something no one else could see. This isn't just another story about cruelty or consequences. This is about a moment that would force three people to confront the ugliest truths about power, prejudice, and the debts we owe to those we'll never meet. Before we dive deep into this extraordinary journey, I want you to know that what you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about redemption and whether someone who has caused such harm can ever make things right. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end because this story has a revelation that will leave you speechless. Let's begin with Seo Jae-won, a 32-year-old mafia boss who had spent his entire life believing that power meant the freedom to hurt anyone he considered beneath him. He wasn't just another criminal. He was a man who had built an empire on fear, intimidation, and a deep-seated belief that some people simply mattered more than others. His colleagues feared him because he showed no mercy. The elite of Seoul courted his favor because they knew he controlled more than they wanted to admit. He had this cold confidence about him that made people look away when he entered a room. Seo had always believed strength meant domination. Growing up in Seoul's underworld, he watched his predecessors rise through brutality and fall through weakness. He learned that showing compassion was a liability, that empathy was for those too weak to take what they wanted. His criminal organization controlled everything from illegal gambling operations to protection rackets across the city. Law enforcement knew his name but could never touch him. Politicians took his money and looked the other way. And Seo. He reveled in it all, believing he was untouchable, believing his power made him superior. Tonight, at his lavish mansion overlooking Seoul, Seo was hosting a party to celebrate another successful year of expanding his empire. The guest list read like a who's who of Seoul's corrupt elite: business executives who laundered his money, lawyers who kept him out of prison, politicians who protected his operations, and socialites who added legitimacy to his image. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over marble floors. Champagne flowed freely. Designer dresses and tailored suits filled every room, and at the center of it all stood Seo Jae-won, the king of his criminal kingdom, accepting praise and tribute from people who needed him more than he needed them. But what Seo didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that among the staff serving his guests was a woman whose very existence would challenge everything he believed about himself. Seo Jae-won didn't just enter rooms. He conquered them. Tonight was no different. He moved through his mansion like a predator surveying his territory, stopping to accept congratulations here, share a calculated laugh there, always watching, always assessing who was useful and who had become expendable. His dark suit was custom-tailored in Milan, his gold chain caught the light with every movement, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. That smile was a weapon he'd perfected over the years, one that could put someone at ease right before he destroyed them. The party was in full swing on the third-floor terrace, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Seoul's glittering skyline. But no one was looking at the view. All eyes were on Seo. They always were. A prominent businessman approached with his wife, both practically bowing as they thanked him for his generosity in resolving a labor dispute at their factory. Seo accepted their gratitude with a slight nod, knowing full well that his solution had involved threatening the union organizers' families until they backed down. That's how things worked in his world. Power wasn't about legality. It was about leverage. Near the bar, a group of politicians laughed too loudly at one of Seo's lieutenant's jokes, desperate to be seen as part of the inner circle. A famous actress posed for photos with Seo's business partners, lending celebrity glamour to what was essentially a gathering of Seoul's criminal elite and their enablers. Everyone here owed Seo something, or needed something from him, or feared what would happen if they refused his invitations. Siyu had built this empire over the past decade through calculated brutality. He'd eliminated rivals who underestimated him, absorbed smaller organizations that couldn't compete, and cultivated relationships with people in positions of authority who found it more profitable to look the other way. His organization controlled illegal gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, and a dozen other revenue streams that generated millions of dollars every month. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the power, the respect, the fear. What made Siyu particularly dangerous was his complete lack of empathy. He saw people as tools or obstacles, nothing more. If you were useful, he kept you close. If you became a liability, you disappeared. He had no patience for weakness, no tolerance for failure, and absolutely no capacity for mercy. His subordinates knew that loyalty meant everything and mistakes meant nothing would save you. Tonight, surrounded by Seoul's corrupt elite, Siyu felt invincible. He had everything he'd ever wanted: money, power, influence, and a city full of people too afraid or too compromised to challenge him. He raised his champagne glass as someone proposed a toast to his continued success, and the room erupted in applause. Siyu's smile widened slightly, that cold, calculating expression that had become his trademark. He had no idea that everything he'd built, everything he believed about himself and his place in the world, was about to come crashing down because of a woman serving drinks in the corner of the room. Margaret Malunda moved through the party like a ghost, her maid's uniform marking her as part of the scenery rather than part of the gathering. She carried a tray of champagne glasses with practiced grace, weaving between clusters of guests who never once looked at her face. To them, she was simply a function, a pair of hands that appeared when glasses needed refilling and disappeared when the task was complete. After 2 years working in Siyu's mansion, Margaret had perfected the art of being invisible. At 28 years old, Margaret carried herself with a dignity that her circumstances couldn't erase. Her posture was upright, her movements precise, and her expression carefully neutral. But anyone who actually looked at her, really looked, would see the tension in her shoulders, the wariness in her eyes, and the way she positioned herself to always have an exit route. These were the habits of someone who had learned that survival meant anticipating danger before it arrived. Margaret hadn't planned to end up in Seoul. 3 years ago, she'd been promised a nursing job in South Korea, a chance to escape the poverty and instability that had defined her life after her mother's death. The recruitment agency in Nairobi had shown her contracts, work permits, photographs of modern hospitals where she would make a decent living and send money home to her younger siblings. She'd believed them because she desperately needed to believe in something better. The truth revealed itself the moment she arrived at Incheon Airport. There was no nursing job, the documents were fake, and the people waiting for her weren't healthcare recruiters. They were traffickers who specialized in trapping foreign women in domestic servitude. Her passport was confiscated. Her debts were suddenly astronomical, and her choices became very simple: work where they placed her, or face consequences she couldn't bear to imagine. Siyu's mansion had been her prison for 2 years. She cleaned, she cooked, she served at parties like this one, and she kept her head down. The other domestic workers were mostly women like her, trafficked from different countries, all carrying their own stories of broken promises and stolen futures. They rarely spoke about their situations, as if putting words to their reality would make it even more unbearable. Tonight, as Margaret navigated through Seoul's elite, she felt the familiar numbness that helped her survive these gatherings. She'd learned not to react when guests made crude jokes about the foreign help. She trained herself not to flinch when their eyes passed over her as if she were furniture. She'd mastered the skill of being present in body while sending her mind somewhere far away, to memories of her mother, to dreams of freedom, to anywhere but here. A businessman gestured impatiently for more champagne without even glancing in her direction. Margaret refilled his glass with steady hands, her face expressionless. She'd survived worse than being ignored. At least being invisible meant being safe. But tonight, invisibility would fail her. Tonight, Siyu Jaiwon would see her, and that attention would change everything. The moment Siyu noticed Margaret, something cruel flickered across his face. He'd been in the middle of a conversation with a cabinet minister when he saw her refilling glasses near the terrace entrance. Perhaps it was the champagne, or perhaps it was simply his nature, but Siyu decided that the party needed more entertainment. He decided that asserting his dominance over someone powerless would remind everyone exactly who controlled this room. "You there?" Siyu called out, his voice cutting through the conversations around him. "Come here." Margaret's hands tightened on her tray, but she moved forward. She'd learned that hesitation only made things worse. As she approached, the conversations around them began to quiet. People sensed something was about to happen, and like spectators at a gladiator match, they turned to watch. Siyu gestured for her to stand in the center of the terrace, directly under the chandelier where everyone could see. "Tell me," he said, his voice dripping with mock curiosity, "where exactly did we find you?" He spoke in Korean, then switched to broken English with an exaggerated accent that made several guests chuckle. "You understand me. You speak Korean." Margaret kept her eyes lowered. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Siyu commanded. When she raised her eyes, he smiled that cold smile. "That's better. You see, everyone," he addressed the crowd, "this is what we have to deal with these days. They come here from who knows where, probably some jungle or desert, and we're supposed to be grateful they grace us with their presence in our country." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt her face grow hot, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd endured worse. She could survive this. But Siyu wasn't finished. He walked around her slowly, performing for his audience. "Tell everyone where you're from. Go ahead, entertain us with your story." When she hesitated, his voice hardened. "I said speak." "I'm from Kenya, sir," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her. "Kenya?" Siyu exclaimed, throwing his hands up dramatically. "Of course, and I suppose you thought you'd come here and live like one of us, thought you deserved to breathe the same air as successful people." He turned to his guests. "This is the problem with these people. They don't understand their place. They need to be reminded." The sound of shattering crystal cut through Siyu's words like a knife. Every head turned toward the source of the noise. Near the windows, a wine glass lay in fragments on the marble floor, dark red liquid spreading across the white stone like blood. But no one was looking at the broken glass. They were looking at Siwa Min, Siyu's mother, standing frozen with her hand pressed against her chest, her elegant face drained of all color, her eyes locked on Margaret with an expression of absolute horror. Siwa Min couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around her as she stared at the young woman standing under the chandelier. Those eyes, that face. The resemblance was impossible to miss once you knew what you were looking for, and Siwa knew. Dear God, she knew. "Mother," Siyu's voice sounded distant, confused by her reaction. "What's wrong?" But Siwa couldn't answer. Her mind had catapulted backward 20 years, to a place she'd spent decades trying not to remember too vividly because the memories were too painful, too precious, too heavy with guilt and gratitude. She'd been 42 years old then, an ambitious journalist determined to document the humanitarian crisis unfolding in East Africa. Her editors had warned her it was too dangerous, that the region was collapsing into violence, but Siwa had been fearless back then. She'd believed that bearing witness to suffering was her calling, that her camera and her words could change the world. The attack had come without warning. Rebel forces sweeping through the refugee camp where she'd been interviewing displaced families. Gunfire, explosions, chaos. Siwa had been hit by shrapnel from a grenade, her leg torn open, blood pouring onto the dusty ground. She'd known she was dying. In that moment, thousands of miles from home, from her young son, from everything she loved, she'd accepted her death. But then there had been hands on her, strong and sure. A voice speaking English with a beautiful East African accent. "Stay with me. I've got you. Don't you dare die on me." Grace Maylinda had been a nurse working with Doctors Without Borders. She'd appeared like an angel through the smoke and dust, dragging Siwa to cover while bullets tore through the air around them. For 3 hours, Grace had worked to keep Siwa alive, using supplies scavenged from the destroyed medical tent, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, whispering encouragement when Siwa begged her to just let her go. "You have a child waiting for you at home," Grace had said firmly. "You told me about your son. He needs his mother. So you're going to fight, and I'm going to make sure you survive this." When the Red Cross evacuation finally arrived, Grace had carried Siwa to the helicopter herself. Before they lifted off, Siwa had gripped Grace's hand. "I'll never forget you," she'd promised. "Never, if there's ever anything I can do." Grace had smiled, exhausted and covered in blood. "Just live well, love your son, that's all I need." Then she'd pressed something into Siwa's hand, a small photograph of herself with a baby girl. "This is my daughter, Margaret. She's my reason for everything." Siwa had kept that photograph for years, tucked in her journal, a reminder of the woman who had given her back her life. Now, standing in her son's mansion, Siwa looked at that baby girl all grown up, wearing a maid's uniform, being humiliated by the very son Grace Maylinda had made it possible for Siwa to raise. "Stop," Siwa whispered, then louder, "stop this right now." The silence that followed Siwa's command was deafening. Siu stared at his mother, confusion giving way to irritation. "Mother, this is hardly the time for." "Do you know who this woman is?" Siwa's voice cut through his words like steel. She moved forward, her elegant gown whispering across the marble floor, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Siu forced a laugh, trying to regain control of the room. "She's just a maid, Mother. You're overreacting." "Her name," Siwa said, her voice shaking now, "is Margaret Maylinda, and her mother saved my life 20 years ago." She turned to face the assembled guests, her composure cracking. "Her mother is the reason I'm standing here, the reason any of us are here, the reason my son exists." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Siu's jaw tightened. "Mother, you're not making sense. Perhaps you should sit down." "Grace Maylinda was a nurse in a refugee camp in East Africa," Siwa continued, ignoring her son's attempt to dismiss her. "When I was injured during an attack, when I was bleeding to death on foreign soil, she risked her own life to save mine. She stayed with me for hours under fire, refused to leave me, carried me to safety." Siwa's voice broke. "Without her, I would have died in that camp. You would never have been born." Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "You knew my mother." Siu stepped between them, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. Even if this story is true, what does it have to do with?" "Everything." Siwa's shout silenced the entire terrace. "It has everything to do with everything." She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking as she pulled up a photo she digitized years ago. She thrust the screen towards Siu. "Look at it. Look." The photograph showed a younger Siwa in a hospital bed, her arm around a black woman in nurse's scrubs, both smiling despite their obvious exhaustion. In the corner was another photo, the same woman holding a baby girl. Siu stared at the image, his confident expression beginning to crack. Around them, guests craned their necks to see, whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd. "That baby," Siwa said, her finger pointing to the photograph, "is the woman you just humiliated, the woman whose mother gave you life by giving me mine." Margaret's legs seemed to buckle. A nearby guest caught her arm to steady her. "My mother never told me," she whispered. "She never said," her voice broke. "She died when I was 16, in another conflict zone. She went back because that's who she was. She couldn't stop helping people." The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. The same guests who'd been laughing moments ago now looked horrified, ashamed, desperate to distance themselves from what they'd witnessed. Several began quietly moving toward the exits. Siu stood frozen, the phone still in his hand. staring at the proof that his entire existence was owed to the woman he just treated as less than human. The party dissolved within an hour. Guests made hurried excuses and slipped away into the Seoul night, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene they'd witnessed. By midnight, the mansion was empty except for Cu, his mother and Margaret, who sat in the kitchen while the other domestic workers cleaned up in shocked silence. Cu had retreated to his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. He tried to process what had happened, tried to rationalize it, minimize it, find some way to maintain the worldview that had defined him for so long. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face. He saw that photograph. He saw Margaret standing there with quiet dignity while he'd torn her apart for entertainment. The door opened without a knock. Siwa entered, her elegant composure replaced by something harder, more dangerous. She'd changed out of her gown into simple clothes, and she carried a folder Cu recognized, his business records, carefully hidden in her safe. Records she wasn't supposed to know about. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold in a way he'd never heard before. "About who you've become, about what ends tonight." Cu tried to summon his usual authority. "Mother, this is none of your—" "I have copies of everything," she interrupted, dropping the folder on his desk. "Every illegal operation, every bribe, every threat. And if you don't listen to what I'm about to say, I will give these to every prosecutor, every journalist, and every rival organization in Seoul. I will destroy everything you've built." Cu stared at her, seeing his mother truly for the first time in years. This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. "That woman downstairs," Siwa continued, "her mother gave me back my life, gave me back to you, and you repaid that debt by humiliating her in front of a room full of people who enabled your cruelty." She leaned forward, her eyes burning. "You will make this right, or I will make sure you lose everything." An hour later, Cu found himself sitting across from Margaret at the kitchen table. She'd refused to meet his eyes at first, but slowly, painfully, they began to talk. She told him about her mother, Grace, who'd spent her life running toward danger instead of away from it, who believed that healing people was the highest calling, who died trying to save lives in a war zone she could have avoided. She told him about the promises made by the recruitment agency, about arriving in Korea full of hope, about the moment that hope was stolen. And then she told him something that made Cu's blood run cold. The trafficking network that had brought her here, it had operated under protection from one of his subsidiary organizations. His people had taken money to look the other way. His empire had enabled her enslavement. "I didn't know," Cu said, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "Does that matter?" Margaret asked quietly. "You built a world where people like me don't matter, where we're invisible until you decide to make us targets. Whether you knew the specific details or not, you created the system that destroyed my life." Cu sat there facing the woman his mother owed everything to, the woman he'd degraded without a second thought, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt something he'd spent years burying: shame. The change didn't happen overnight. Cu spent 3 days locked in his study, going through every operation his organization touched, every business relationship, every source of revenue. What he found sickened him. The trafficking network wasn't an isolated incident. His empire had intersected with human exploitation in dozens of ways he'd never bothered to examine. Protection money from businesses that employed trafficked workers, loans to operations that moved people across borders, bribes paid to officials who ignored smuggling routes. He'd built his power on the suffering of people he'd never even seen. On the 4th day, he called Margaret and his mother to his study. "I want to make this right," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try." Margaret looked at him with careful skepticism. "What does making it right look like to you?" Cu pulled out a detailed map he'd created, marked with locations, routes, and connections. "I know how these networks operate. I know who protects them, who profits from them, and how they move people. I can use that knowledge to dismantle them." He paused. "But I need your help, both of you." Over the following weeks, an unlikely alliance formed. Siwa used her journalism contacts to verify information and build cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. Margaret, drawing on her own painful experience, helped them understand how victims were recruited, controlled, and silenced. And Cu, leveraging relationships he'd once used for exploitation, began gathering intelligence on trafficking operations across Seoul and beyond. They established the Grace Melinda Foundation with a clear mission: rescue trafficked individuals, prosecute their exploiters, and provide survivors with resources to rebuild their lives. Cu liquidated legitimate assets to fund it, while quietly using his criminal connections to identify targets. The first rescue came 6 weeks after the party. A group of Filipino women trapped in a massage parlor, their passports confiscated, their families threatened if they tried to escape. Cu's information led authorities to the location. Siwa's media contacts ensured the story received attention, and Margaret was there when the women emerged, speaking to them in English, assuring them they were safe now, that someone saw them. Watching Margaret work, Cu saw the transformation beginning in her. The woman who'd been invisible at his party now spoke with authority, organized resources, and advocated fiercely for the survivors. She'd found her voice, and it was powerful. The second rescue targeted a construction site using trafficked Cambodian laborers. The third freed domestic workers from situations similar to Margaret's own. With each operation, the foundation grew stronger, and Margaret grew into her role as its moral center. One evening, after successfully freeing a group of Nepalese women from a factory, Margaret found Cu reviewing files for their next target. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "My mother used to say that people aren't defined by their worst moments," she said quietly. "They're defined by what they do after those moments, by whether they choose to grow or to stay broken." Cu looked up, seeing something in her expression he didn't quite deserve. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something like respect. "I'm not doing this for redemption," he said honestly. "I know I can't earn that." "No," Margaret agreed, "but maybe you can earn something better, a purpose worth living for." The first warning came in the form of a bullet through Siwa's living room window. She was at her desk working on an exposé about government officials who protected trafficking networks when the glass exploded inward. The shot missed her by inches, embedding itself in the wall behind her chair. The message was clear: stop, or the next one won't miss. Cu immediately moved both women to a secure location, but he knew it was only a matter of time. He'd spent years building relationships with criminal organizations across Seoul, and now those same organizations saw him as a threat. The foundation had disrupted their revenue streams, exposed their operations, and worst of all, demonstrated that someone from within their world could turn against them. 2 weeks later, Margaret's car was rigged with explosives. Only a last-minute check by Cu's security team prevented disaster. That same night, 3 men broke into Cu's apartment. He survived only because he'd anticipated the attack and had his own people waiting. But the real danger came from an unexpected direction. A federal prosecutor named Kim reached out to Cu through encrypted channels. The government had been building a case against a massive trafficking network with connections to politicians, police officials, and business leaders across Asia. They had evidence, but they needed someone with inside knowledge to testify, someone who understood how the entire system worked. They needed Cu. "If you testify," Prosecutor Kim explained during their secret meeting, "you'll be admitting to crimes that will send you to prison. But you'll also bring down an operation that's destroyed thousands of lives. We can offer reduced sentencing in exchange for cooperation, but you'll be marked for death by every organization you expose." Cu sat in his safe house that night, weighing his options. He could refuse to testify, continue the Foundation's work on a smaller scale, and possibly survive. Or he could take the stand, face his own crimes publicly, and destroy the networks that had enabled horrors like what happened to Margaret. The decision was made more complicated when Margaret walked into the room. She'd overheard his conversation with the prosecutor. "You're actually considering this," she said, not quite a question. "These people need to be stopped," CU replied. "Properly stopped, not just individual rescues but dismantling the entire structure. You'll go to prison. You'll be a marked man for the rest of your life." Margaret's voice carried a strange mixture of concern and something else he couldn't quite identify. "I know." Margaret was silent for a long moment. CU expected her to encourage him to save himself, to point out that he'd already done more than anyone could have expected. Instead, she said something that surprised him. "If you testify, I testify with you, about my experience, about what these networks do to people." She met his eyes steadily. "You're not facing this alone." CU stared at her. "You don't have to do this. You've already been through enough." "That's exactly why I have to," Margaret said firmly. "My mother spent her life saving people. This is how I honor that, not by staying silent but by speaking so loudly they can't ignore us." Siwa entered the room, her expression resolute. "I'll testify too, about the connections I've uncovered through my journalism. They can threaten us, but they can't silence all three of us." Siu looked at these two women, one who owed him nothing, one who'd given him everything, both willing to risk their lives because it was the right thing to do. For the first time since that terrible night at the party, he understood what real strength looked like. It looked nothing like the man he used to be. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and families of trafficking victims when CU took the stand. For 3 days, he detailed the infrastructure of corruption that had enabled human exploitation across Seoul and beyond. He named names: politicians who'd accepted bribes, police officers who'd looked the other way, business leaders who'd knowingly employed trafficked workers. He confessed his own role in creating and maintaining systems that had destroyed countless lives. The defense attorneys tried to discredit him, painting him as a criminal seeking leniency, but CU never denied what he was. "I built an empire on the suffering of people I never bothered to see as human," he said, his voice steady. "I can't undo that, but I can make sure the network that enabled it burns to the ground." When Margaret took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke with a quiet power that commanded attention, describing her recruitment in Nairobi, her arrival in Seoul filled with hope, and the moment that hope was stolen. She detailed the mechanisms of control: confiscated documents, manufactured debts, threats against families back home. She became the voice for every person who'd been silenced, every victim who'd been made invisible. "My mother saved lives because she believed every person had inherent worth," Margaret testified. "The people who trafficked me believed the opposite. They saw us as commodities, and systems like the one Mr. Jaiwan enabled allowed them to operate with impunity." She looked directly at the judges. "This isn't just about punishing individuals. It's about dismantling the structures that make this exploitation possible." The trial lasted 6 weeks. When the verdicts came, they were sweeping. 17 high-ranking officials convicted, 4 major trafficking networks dismantled, and reforms mandated across law enforcement and immigration systems. CU received a reduced 8-year sentence for his cooperation, but he'd achieved what he set out to do. 3 years later, Margaret stood at a podium in Geneva, addressing an international conference on human trafficking. The Grace Melinda Foundation had expanded to 12 countries, rescuing over 2,000 victims and successfully prosecuting hundreds of traffickers. Margaret had become a globally recognized advocate, her testimony used in training programs and policy discussions worldwide. In the audience, Siwa watched with tears in her eyes. This was Grace's legacy, not just saving one life, but creating ripples that spread across oceans and generations. CU watched on a screen from prison, where he spent his days coordinating intelligence for ongoing investigations. He would never be the man he was before that party. The empire he'd built was gone, his reputation destroyed, his freedom stripped away. But in its place was something he'd never had when he ruled through fear: purpose. As Margaret concluded her speech with a photograph of her mother, explaining how Grace had taught her that healing the world started with seeing each person's humanity, the audience rose in standing ovation. Sometimes the most powerful transformations come from the moments we least expect: a cruel man forced to confront his evil, a silenced woman finding her voice, a debt repaid across generations. This story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to face the truth about themselves, and that sometimes the people we dismiss as powerless are the ones who hold the keys to our very existence. True power isn't found in domination. It's found in the courage to admit you were wrong and dedicate everything you have to making it right. Thank you for listening till the end. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Where in the world are you turning in from? Let me know in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. I appreciate the time you spent here with me today.